It's such a delight to be learning together with everyone today, to be meeting you, seeing you here in New York City. I'm so humbled to be able to share some thoughts with you as we mark this occasion and this special moment. And I'm grateful to the entire Hadran community, and especially Rabbanit Michelle, for everything you have done to empower and inspire so many women and men. My 16-year-old son studies for his Gemara test with your podcast. So thank you really from Me'omak HaLev, really. I'm so grateful personally and communally, professionally. And as we approach Pesach, I was asked to speak about creativity and offer some framing and some practical takeaways for the Seder. So this is the practical dimension of our Siyum today, on how to cultivate creativity at the Seder and how to do that specifically for adults. I'm going to share my screen here with you, and I will of course share all of this, link to this at the end in the chat, so that if I go quickly, you'll have it all at the end. So there are a lot of things here, a lot of ideas, and we will share it, so not to worry. So, and also if you're just listening and you're not looking, now might be the time that you want to look at your screen. There are a lot of images that we'll be using for the next 10 minutes or so. We so often think of creativity as something, sorry, one second, let me put it in present mode. Okay. We so often think of creativity as something that is for the young. It's a domain for children, and the adults provide the frameworks and the structures for the creative construction of our young ones to take place. But actually, there are a lot of reasons for that. There's practical reasons, there's developmental reasons, there's sociological reasons. We can unpack all the reasons why creativity is viewed as a children's domain at a different time. But it's clear that Chazal in the Mishnah and the Gemara and throughout sort of the conception of what the Seder should be like, they're attuned to the fact that it's easier to get children to ask questions, of course, but they make a point early on in the haggadah that the obligation to recall the narrative of Exodus, to engage with it creatively, to tell the story, to animate it, to make it a part of an essence of who you are, to bring your full totality to the haggadah, to the Seder, is incumbent upon everyone, old and young. And we see at the beginning when we read Avadim Hayinu, and I'll just highlight that one line, right? Afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu nivonim, kulanu zkenim, kulanu yodim et haTorah, mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yitziat Mitzrayim. Even if you're older, even if you're knowledgeable, even if you are discerning, even if you're an elder, it is incumbent upon you to tell the story of the Exodus of Egypt. This is a moment when everyone needs to be engaged. It's for everyone, all ages. Despite the fact that the makot sets come for the little children, this is really a moment for an adult to engage in creativity, and that's what we're going to talk about and give some practical takeaways today. And before we jump into the practical takeaways, which we will, I wanted to just share an expression of that and a thought that I thought really engaged with this moment at this Siyum. And this is just from Professor Daniel Boyarin. From about 10 years ago, there was a symposium on the origins of Jewish creativity at Moment magazine. And I'll just read the first line out loud, because I thought it was a really powerful expression of both creativity and engaging with the moment that we are in right now as we're Mesayim Masechet Pesachim. And he says in the symposium, and I can send the link to it afterwards, I'm sorry it's not here, the Babylonian Talmud is the most extraordinary creation of the Jewish people. Professor Boyarin is in Berkeley saying this to the world. It speaks a kind of manic energy and records that extraordinary energy and vitality from the areas where it was produced in the Babylonian diaspora. Jews were imbued with creative energy through the intense study of this one peculiar, vibrant work through the centuries. And he continues in a very wonderful essay that you can all read online if you Google it, about the way that the Bavli actually is an expression of the creativity in all of us. So when we think about this moment, right, we're not talking about creativity just because Pesach is coming up, but we're talking about creativity because actually imbued in the Bavli, in a diasporic work of creative construction from being part of different societies, different cultures, is a deep, deep rooted creative capacity. And so I wanted to use that as a launch point to talk about some of the very specific ideas that we can take away, the practical dimension. This isn't, the lumdish dimension, but it's the practical dimension for our Seder. And if we're going to look at four different, is sort of the way I categorized it in a Talmudic way. Of course, creativity is creativity, but it has to be sort of characterized. I do characterize into four different domains, but we'll talk about in the next few minutes. One is the power of the image. 2 is the sense of putting yourself into a story, or the story in this case. 3, a particular thematic anchoring. And 4, what I call innovation within tradition. So let's just start with the power of the image. Haggadot have been illustrated and animated for centuries, from the illuminated medieval Haggadot to contemporary graphic design and pop art. And there's a rich illustration of Haggadot, animation and visualization. And given the world that we live in right now, the fact that we're walking around with devices in our pocket, everyone in the world is suddenly walking around as a photographer. And I think as a practical dimension, the integration of photography into the Seder experience, not just as illumination, but actually as interpretation and as individualized experience, is something that we can capitalize on this very moment when we're all sort of trying to figure out ways of how can we take experiences that we're living in and bring them to our Seder. Now, as an amateur photographer, this is something that speaks very greatly to me. The power of the image. This is just an image, one of many images that I took on the Lower East Side many years ago, of maror being made with a gas mask, and sort of all the different ambiguous meanings that are moved by the power of the image. And that, you know, it speaks to me a great deal, but I think it can speak to every one of us a great deal at this moment. And a way to do that at the Seder is to actually say, this is practical, right? Ask each guest at your Seder to bring a photo that represents something. That something might be freedom, it might be slavery, it might be bondage, it might be identity, it might be tradition, it might be a very particular segment of the haggadah, and then bring that to the Seder. Now, of course, at this moment, we are not all having guests at our Seder, but this is actually something that works beautifully to say, send me something beforehand. It's so easy to walk around the next 3 days and say, right, the next week, and look around and say, what represents freedom for me? What represents bondage for me? What represents the moment that we're in? Write a few sentences about it and have people express that, send it in an email, and then read it, print it out at your Seder, so that those people who perhaps are not at your Seder this year are then actually there. If you're really ambitious, you can collect those into a new version of a haggadah, offering different people in the family to say, here's a different section for you to animate visually. Again, because of the ease that we can do this, it's something that we can kind of pull together. There's wonderful resources online, haggadot.com. You can insert your own image along with the text of the haggadah, and boom, you have, right, a family heirloom that can be evolving each year dependent on the moment. And I think particularly this year, like last, many people will be relying on the power of the image and the visualization and the visual, because we will not be with all of our friends, family, our rituals, our objects. We don't have them. And there's a real power of bringing that images into the Seder. Practical idea number 1, right? Have everybody take pictures this week. I've done it in all different contexts, and it's been quite interesting. For me, the image of bondage goes back to New York City last year at the end of March, when I walked around empty streets of Manhattan and saw locks on museums and locks on parks, right? I think there's a real power in bringing the moment into the moment that we are in. The second practical idea is what I call putting yourself in the story. And here relies heavily on diary entries. As we know, when we read early on in the Haggadah, B'chol davar chayav adam lirot, Ashkenazic tradition, or leharot, the Rambam, the Edot Mizrach, right, has a different reflexive verb. In every generation, a person is obligated to see him or herself, or to demonstrate as if he left Mitzrayim. We have an obligation to actually put ourselves in that story. Now, by the way, this isn't my child. This is just a stock image. I use, some of them are mine. This is not. I didn't think he would want that. But that sense of taking ourselves and looking and seeing and putting ourselves in this story. And a very practical way, and again, I'm happy to send this to you, is to have diary entries. We've done this with guests in the past. We're doing it again this year, is to ask your guests, your students, your community to write the page of a diary of somebody who left Mitzrayim on Tedvav Nisan. What would that look like? What would it sound like? Now, we sent homework email a few weeks before Pesach to our guests and having them really think about it. Now, of course, it's again another, example of somebody where a case where if somebody's not at your Seder, you can print that up in advance, bring it, read it. Some of them will connect to very particular parts of the Haggadah. Others will kind of be an overlay. you know, in this situation in the past, we've had really interesting, and again, I have some here for you to read afterwards. We've had really interesting responses. I think some people, some of my family members are actually on right now. This might be some of yours from the years past, but people have taken different perspectives. The perspective of Yocheved, the perspective one year we had of the frogs. One year we also had the, you know, the Egyptian child trying to make sense of it all. A street cleaner cleaning up the blood, historical characters, right? Giving a very specific anchoring and saying, be someone. We had, you know, this was a very poignant one. The case of, you know, somebody wrote as if they were a Jewish Israelite woman who was in a relationship with an Egyptian and had to make a decision, an identity decision. Do I leave or do I stay? It was very powerful and very interesting, but it allows us, when we get into the mind and to inhabit the mind of others, to share that experience and then write ourselves into that experience. Again, I know I'm running through this, but I will absolutely share these with you. The third practical, again, these are practical takeaways. The third practical takeaway and the next opportunity for creativity is one I just want to mention, but can go in so many different dimensions, is a thematic anchoring, right? Creating a very particular theme for your Seder and anchoring your Seder in a particular framework which operates as an organizing principle. And that can then really give people an opportunity to bring all kinds of sources, imagery, articles, books, sources, texts, poems, songs, images that respond and connect to different dimensions of the Seder and to different dimensions of the haggadah. Now, I've put just a few up. There's many more that we can talk about, but once you give a theme, right, those themes allow you to have an access point in. And this is the interesting case where limitation actually breeds creativity. There's a lot of academic research on how actually constraints breed creativity. And this is exactly a case where we say, we are constraining you to talk about color at this Seder in some dimension, in some way. And that will allow for different guests of all different ages, from the youngest to the oldest, to think about in what ways does the red vibrancy of the blood relate to their own individual expression and experience of the Seder. Here are just some examples: water, freedom. Freedom, we particularly did one year 1960s style. We tie-dyed 2 weeks before Pesach. We were tie-dyeing pillowcases and bringing in free to be you and me poems to sort of engage, right, the moments, the different dimensions of what freedom actually has meant throughout the centuries, throughout the years, in a very, very particular moment. Sustainability, color, global responsibility, personal autonomy, identity, community, senses, vulnerability, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's, you know, there's many more, but just the general idea is that when you give a theme, you can anchor both the intellectual and the sort of visceral, hands-on creative. And that's a way of saying, what can my, you know, 80-year-old father bring to the Seder that relates to vulnerability or to color? And then my 6-year-old son can craft something in that same color scheme, and it brings together all the different dimensions. I think sometimes that's the hardest, is thinking about all the different ages that we have at our Seder. But anchoring in a theme allows for so many different people to bring their experiences, their expressions, and their voices to the common text. And finally, the last sort of thematic construct that I want to offer as a takeaway is what I call innovation within tradition, or perhaps, you know, engaging our moment within the lens of other moments. Now, as we know, the Seder is so much a part of a continuous process of innovation, anchored in the depths of tradition. It's taking a text, exploring it, building upon it, giving the very particular moments and individualized experiences. And something that we have done in the past, again, I'm drawing from my own experiences. I'm not a formal, right? This is not formal. This is just from my own life. Something we've done in the past with our own children, and actually last year when it was just our children, is that we asked them to look at older haggadot, right? To look at different haggadot and collections from around the world and bring different ones that they found interesting that relates to a very particular moment in time. And we were lucky, we have this volume of Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, Alav Shalom, from Columbia originally. And this is a wonderful volume that has plates and representations from the last 500 years of haggadot from the Judaica collections of Harvard University and of the Jewish Theological Seminary, with a bit of description. So we were able to give to our 15-year-olds and 17-year-olds and our little guys and say, look at this, right? Tell me something from history that speaks to you, and bringing that moment into our moment. And I wanted to share two plates, two renditions from that my children selected. So this is what they did last year. And the first is from the Haggadah Beit Hashita, which is kibbutz founded in 1935. And this is their Haggadah in 1947. I thought it was really powerful on their Halach Ma'anya illustration. It depicts a communal Seder in the kibbutz dining hall. That kind of gives you that sense of like, that's what a Seder is like in 1947 on a kibbutz. And what was so powerful about that is that just 10 or 15 pages later, we also see a very dark expression of bringing yourself into the Haggadah. And this is a poem, a very heartfelt poem about losing a world, about people in grief and anguish. The author of this poem was Yitzchak Katzenellenson, who was a Hebrew and Yiddish poet and dramatist who unfortunately perished in Auschwitz. And his poem made its way, I don't know exactly historically how, but it's made its way into this Haggadah in the Kibbutz Beit Hashita. And that sense of, on one page, you can have the entire community in the kibbutz mess hall and the dining hall experiencing that sort of excitement, enthusiasm, and revelry. And just 10 pages later in the Haggadah, really recognizing the depth of tragedy and human loss in an artistic way through this poem was a profound when I saw that juxtaposition. That's just one example. Another example, and we'll close up in just a minute, was something that I found in a Haggadah from Italy in 1560, the Mantua Haggadah, which in many ways has Ashkenazic sort of resonances to it, and it brings a tradition from Denmark, but it does we have this very interesting depiction, and we have the pictures up here on the page of the Arba Banim. The Chacham is pictured, and in the lower left, you see the full page here. And in his spirit, he descends from all sort of older manuscripts of Haggadah illustrations, in which the wise son has a long beard and he's sitting with his cap, and that's the Chacham, right? That's the depiction of the Chacham. But actually, and this is something that Professor Yerushalmi points out, I don't know, yes, no, I thought, take it for what it's worth, it's kind of interesting. There is this model for the Chacham at this moment in time, and it seems to be a fairly faithful copy of Michelangelo's Jeremiah in the fresco of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in 1512. So if you look at those side by side, the legs, the arm, the face, there is this resonance of the Chacham in the Haggadah from Mantua that seems to be adopted from the Sistine Chapel. Now, I think it's just fascinating to see the ways here that surrounding cultures, the moment, the ethos, right, where we are at permeates our textual traditions. This is just one example of how it plays out. There are many, many examples. So you can ask your guests, if you don't have your Yerushalmi's volume, but you can ask your guests, your family, look for all the different Haggadot that are out there, bring one from a particular historical moment in time and how it speaks to different resonances to where we are and where we perhaps could have been, should have been, may have been, have been. And finally, and I'll just 1 minute on this, our moment at this present moment is actually a moment to think about in so many different dimensions, a moment of plague, a moment of bondage, a moment of freedom. We're opening into a new moment where we can engage the world in vulnerable ways, but also empowered ways. And so I was very, very blessed over the last few months to construct a collaborative project with a number of different organizations and colleagues engaging in the moment that we're in, thinking about our current plague that we're living through in the context of Makot and plagues throughout Jewish history in general, and the ways that they can illuminate our experiences from other collective historical experiences. I feel badly that I'm, throwing things out, but I feel happy and empowered that I can leave you with a website to say, go explore, think of all the different ways that we can engage with frogs and the works of Shai Agnon and bring that back to our Seder, and perhaps the moments of what this moment brings to all of us in terms of vulnerability. And as we celebrate our Siyum today, intellectual, creative work, and an endeavor, I really invite everyone to think of ways to take that intellectual creativity alongside all the other more hands-on, tactile, creative dimensions and blend them into ways that enable us to see ourselves both historically and presently in the moment of Pesach experience, in our full creative capacity. So I hope this just sparked some ideas. Again, in just a second, I'll put the link into the chat. You can all look at this. There's many more ideas. I hope to explore them with you at some point, but I just want to wish everyone a mazal tov, chag kasher v'sameach, an inspired, creative, and a healthful chag. And thank you so much again.